The Bengals last year, going into 2023, were one of the top preseason Super Bowl favorites to represent the AFC. But unfortunately, they ran into a pretty significant roadblock just as training camp began when Joe Burrow suffered a pretty bad injury. And they were fortunate, at least fortunate, that they were going to have him come week 1. But it became apparent because he didn't have training camp to prepare. He didn't have preseason to get any reps in. He looked pretty rusty. He didn't look prepared to go. I mean, it comes when you don't have training camp. It comes when you don't have preseason. So Joe Burrow expectedly struggled, and so did the rest of the team in the first quarter of 2023. And just when the Bengals were starting to find their footing after the first couple of games in that year, and it seemed like they're finally going to get back on track after a big win against the Buffalo Bills. Right around the corner was a key game against the Baltimore Ravens. And in that game, they lost starting quarterback Joe Burrow for the season with a serious wrist injury. So everything seems all lost. Season's over for the Cincinnati Bengals, at least to the eyes of their fan base. But backup quarterback Jake Browning surprisingly kept the team afloat in the playoff picture. And lo and behold, they were staring right at the 7th seed. But unfortunately, the Bengals lost 2 of their last 3 games, and they fell just a little bit short of making the playoffs at a record of 9-8. So on a positive note, at least, you end the season with a winning record, but you don't make the playoffs, and you're last in the division. But hey, you still have your hat to hang on with 9 wins. So it's not all bad in the world if you're Cincinnati. That being said, there's a little bit of change to come over if you were the Bengals going into the offseason, because if you want to get back to the heights of the playoffs and try to once again get back to the Super Bowl, which was your ultimate goal going into 2024, obviously the thing you had to do was keep Joe Burrow healthy. But again, there are some changes that they had to address first, and one of those changes came with replacing your offensive coordinator, Brian Callahan, because he decided to go and be the new head coach for the Tennessee Titans. So they made an in-house promotion with quarterbacks coach Dave Pitcher, obviously working with Joe Burrow very frequently, and now he gets to work with the entire offense. They also franchise tag receiver T. Higgins. We still don't know if they're going to come to a long-term deal, but we will see. But T. Higgins at least signed his franchise tag tender, and now he's here for at least for this season. They also traded away running back Joe Mixon to the Houston Texans, which was a little bit of a surprising move, but they managed to address that part in replacing him. And then in the event of emergency break glass event again, they re-signed backup Jake Browning. So there you go. Some of the other moves that the Bengals made in this past offseason, not a whole lot that they lost, but not a whole lot that they added either. But one big player that they lost this past offseason was corner Chidobe Awuzie, their top corner in that offense. So a little bit of concern for that Bengals defense. They also lost their receiver number 3, Tyler Boyd, to the Tennessee Titans. So both of them go over to Tennessee. They also lost one of their key defensive tackles, DJ Reader, to the Detroit Lions, and one of their offensive linemen in Jonah Williams to Arizona. So actually, I do take that back on what I said earlier. Maybe there were those two players were key losses, them going to Tennessee. So they tried to address this through free agency and the draft, like by getting safeties Geno Stone and Von Bell from the Ravens and the Panthers, respectively. Von Bell comes back after a 1-year stint in Carolina. They also addressed Joe Mixon's trade by getting Zach Moss from the Indianapolis Colts. And then they also addressed Jonah Williams' departure by getting Trent Brown from the Patriots. So they're clearly trying to, once again, address the offensive line because it has been an issue since the Super Bowl of last year. Not last year, a couple years ago against the Rams. So they continue to address that in the draft by getting a tackle by the name of Amarius Mims from Georgia. And then much later on, they get a center, Matt Lee from Miami, as the depth piece. And then some other moves that they made in this draft by getting a defensive tackle by the name of Chris Jenkins, as well as McKinley Jackson from both of them coming from Michigan and Texas A&M respectively. They also get a receiver by the name of Jermaine Byrne from Alabama to try and replace Tyler Boyd as well. And then to address their secondary, they grabbed Josh Noon from TCU, a corner, by the way. So when you look at the Bengals offseason to try and bounce back from a kind of middling campaign, but it was a little understandable because they lost their quarterback, Joe Burrow, midway through the season. So when you look at it, their passing defense should be a little bit better this year because it wasn't exactly world beating. It was actually like getting on the borderline of, this is not great. Because when you look at it, especially last year, and when you look at the deep back end of the field for Cincinnati's defense, Jesse Bates created a big hole for that passing defense. So Jesse Bates' departure was sorely felt. Cincinnati gave up a very good amount of plays, well deep downfield, and sometimes like in the mid range of the field as well. But they nicely addressed that this past offseason. They stole away Geno Smith from the division rival Ravens. And again, they got back Von Bell, who is very familiar with this team. But the cornerback spots, they do need to be addressed at some point during training camp and hopefully during the preseason because Mike Hilton is their only best corner. And, well, Chidobe Awuzie is now on the Titans. So they don't really have anyone opposite Mike Hilton. And, well, the other person next to him. So they're going to need someone to step up. Will it be DJ Turner making big strides in year 2? Is it going to be Cam Taylor-Britt? We'll see. On the opposite side of the ball, you have the offensive line. Again, it's being addressed, and it should continue to be addressed because obviously protecting your quarterback should be the number one investment. But like I said, this offensive line has always been a major issue since that Super Bowl loss to the Rams. Well, actually, that whole season leading up to that Super Bowl loss to LA. But it just felt like, no matter how much they addressed it in the 2 seasons that followed it, it just felt like it never really did anything. Joe Burrow continues to take a good amount of sacks. He took a good amount of hits, but it just felt like nothing was working. So they're trying again with these various moves like Trent Brown and Amarius Mims to try and compete with one another for one of those right tackle spots. And then, well, we'll see if this offensive line works with them joining an interior to try and bounce back. Especially when this offensive line had a down year, especially from Alex Kappa, Ted Karras, and center Cordell Volson, as well as left tackle Orlando Brown Jr., who joined last year. So looking at some of the key games for Cincinnati going into this year as they try to bounce back from a kind of down year, you look at week 2, going on the road to face Kansas City in the Chiefs' second home game to kick off the year. So that's a pretty big game for both of these teams, but especially for Cincinnati if they're going to try to compete for a playoff spot and try to send a statement early that, oh, hey, we're back. Speaking of trying to make sure that you're back, week 5, you host the Baltimore Ravens in a key division game, as well as 2 weeks later against the Cleveland Browns. Going to Cleveland and, well, trying to reclaim the top spot in the division. You could potentially get 2 key wins in the AFC North race already. So going into 2024, I mean, I keep talking about the offensive line, but you really want to hope, if you're a Bengals fan, that all these auditions finally start to come together and protect Joe Burrow, not just for half the season, not just for most of the season, but for all season long, because you have to wonder if they can come together, because I certainly think they can. But we've yet to see it. They've invested in the offensive line for how many seasons now? Since the Super Bowl against the Rams. But I feel like this has to be the year that Joe Burrow stays completely healthy if the Bengals want to make a run. And a lot of that has to start with the offensive line. Like, they have to do their job and protect their quarterback, especially from injury. Like, they can't let him get hurt. So for the Bengals, despite there's a couple of deficiencies, a couple of losses in free agency, they looked like a Super Bowl contender from the last two seasons. And going into this year, they'll surely do so again with Joe Burrow fully healthy And I feel like they addressed a couple of their losses pretty relatively decent. So if the key thing is for Cincinnati is to obviously, like I said, keep Joe Burrow healthy, because he's going to have to offset some losses in that defense, especially in the passing defense, because there's a key amount of them. So if they can overcome those problems, then I do believe that the Bengals should be right on track from going from the worst team in the AFC North, which not necessarily they were the worst, but to first in the AFC North. And then we'll see how they fare if they get to the postseason.